Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today, we are hosting a conversation celebrating the new book, My Dark Room, Spaces of the Inner Self in 18th Century England. Today, we have author Julie Park, joined in conversation by Jayne Lewis. My name is Meredith Naney. I'm a promotions manager at the University of Chicago Press. I will sort of be helping host today. I've had the opportunity to work with Julie on her book. I'm so excited that we are able to celebrate it today as part of our By the Book virtual event series. By the Book events are presented in collaboration with the Seminary Co-op Bookstore. And this series aims to bring big ideas and smart conversations directly to you. My Dark Room was officially published in August and is available now for purchase at the Seminary Co-op. You'll find a link to order the book in the chat. Before we get started, I'd just like to ask everyone to keep their sound muted throughout the event so we don't have any background noise. I will here offer a brief introduction of our two guests. Then we'll have our conversation and about 15 minutes at the end of the event available for a question and answer period. So please feel free to place your questions in the Zoom chat at any time. Or when we get to the end of the event, if you'd like to ask a question verbally, just go ahead and raise your hand and we will call on you. All right, so today we have, we have Julie Park, who is a scholar of 18th century England working at the crossroads of literary studies, material and visual culture, and textual materiality. She is the paternal family librarian for literature and professor of English at Pennsylvania State University. She is the author of The Self and It, Novel Objects in 18th Century England, and co-editor of Organic Supplements, Bodies and Things of the Natural World, 1580 to 1790. Jayne Lewis is professor of English at the University of California, Irvine. She's the author of Air's Appearance, Literary Atmosphere in British Fiction, 1660 to 1794, as well as numerous other monographs, articles on the 18th century literature and culture. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. I'll turn over the conversation to Julie and Jayne.
Okay. Hi, Julie. I think we agreed I was going to start us off today. So I do just have to say, like, what a delight and an honor it is to get to celebrate this book with you and to talk about it with you, about your dark room and, your dark room. It's also My Dark Room, the title of the book, and talking about it from my semi-dark room here in California, 3,000 miles away, but so many distances are so beautifully spanned. And I know you wrote a significant part of this book here. So in a wonderful way, I really feel like I'm talking to you at home and in my home, albeit with all these other people. So anyway, I am just thrilled to be here and to be able to hear more about what you have to say about this book. I did, since this is a launch, my assumption is that most people haven't read the book yet. I really envy everyone who has that in their future, because one of the things about this book is that it is such an incredible pleasure simply to read. And it is so much about the pleasure not just of reading, but far more of writing, and the extent to which it captures that and integrates that into its methodology is really, really powerful. And what we also have here, of course, are all kinds of fascinating interactions with material culture, with the history of architecture, with anthropology. So this is just an incredibly erudite book. It's also a profoundly imaginative book. I was thinking, we're in the Enlightenment, we're in the 18th century with Julie's book, which Bill Warner and Cliff Siskin defined as an event in the history of mediation. And I feel as if what Julie is giving us is an event in the history of the imagination. And so I'm very grateful for that and for the affordances of this book to help us understand the way we imagine now and where that came from in relation to some of the things that Julie's talking about in her book. The title, My Dark Room, is my favorite title, I think, of an academic book that I've seen in a very, very long time. And I think kind of sets up the expectation that we're going to be talking about the camera lucida, which of course has been the 19th century invention that has really defined our definitions of realism in so many ways. The title alone would remind us, if it were that kind of book, that what matters with photography and photorealism is not just the instrument, but also the room in which photographs for so long were developed. But this isn't about that. It's about the object that is at the center of this book for Julie is the camera obscura. And one of the things she gives us is its genealogy and its evolution in the 18th century in tandem with domestic space and various kinds of transformations in that realm, and also in relation to the space of primarily narrative, even though she also talks about a number of poems as well. So that interaction is part of what's so just incredibly fertile about this lucidly, never obscurely written book that also recovers the spaces of darkness, the spaces inside the self in the so-called Enlightenment, and really does a fascinating job of making us rethink interiority as something that moves from the spaces we inhabit inward at the same time that it moves outward in this deeply dynamic, really interesting way that goes beyond some of the projections of self into environment that Benjamin talks about, for example. So Julie's looking at that dynamic here and introducing a number of really fascinating new terms for tools for us to use in terms of understanding the kinds of effects of interiority and spatial awareness that are created within 18th century literature and culture. And the book also moves through a series of spaces, which its ordering is maybe something we might want to talk about, because I'm really interested just in how this book works as itself a book, which is about the book and its relationship to the camera lucida. But Julie moves through various spaces: the country house, the grotto, the closet, the pocket, and the Gothic folly, more or less in chronological order, kind of like an enfilade of rooms, the row. But because she has such powerful close reading skills, which are implemented here, we're also moving deeper and deeper into each room, which contains the next room. So that effect is also really, really powerful. There's also a strong photographic presence here. The number of, I think there must have been maybe 75 illustrations here, all photographs by definition, but interacting in really interesting ways with the text. So last thing I'll say, just before I have a very specific question that I want to ask Julie. So just to kind of start us off, and we'll just be talking about her book from that point on. But Julie's previous book, which many of us know really well, The Self and It, Novel Objects and Mimetic Experience in the 18th century, it was a book which really looked at objects and instruments, puppets, dolls, automata, etc., to get at the experience of interiority, and thought very much through the language of mimesis. This is a book about spaces, but they depend on a particular object in order to be illuminated for us, and that's the camera lucida, which moves us beyond the mimetic into the immersive and the aesthetic, and these boundaries between fantasy life and empirical physical life that really get unlocked in such creative, interesting, and I feel deeply personal ways as well. The first person of the title, My Dark Room, I see this as in many ways the autobiography of an incredibly interesting scholar who has moved through so many different spaces to produce this book. So I hope that wasn't all over the place, Julie. I'm sorry to have gone on for a while, but just so that we kind of know what we're talking about here. I wanted to start with what isn't mentioned in your title, which is the camera obscura. And I wanted to ask you a little bit just about that and your relationship to the camera obscura. I feel like it's almost a character in the book. I feel like it's almost the narrator of the book. It's amusing the ways that it sort of turns up in the book. People start to carry them in their pockets, little, cell phones in the middle of the 18th century. I knew what I thought. I knew what a camera obscura was. I kind of feel like I don't know that anymore. But I wonder if you could maybe start, and you could also maybe weave into this a little bit of the story about where the book came from for you, and some of the research that you did to produce it. But I really just want to know, first off, just about the camera, the CO, not to be confused with CO2, right? As just such a fascinating player in your imagination. And my intuition is that this has to have started with your relationship to that object, given that you were handling objects in your previous book. So so that's what I want to know. It's like, what where does the camera obscura come from? How did you become interested in it? Anything you want to say about that and how that led you into the really fascinating process of this book would be something I'd love to hear about, and I'm sure everybody else would as well.
Thank you. Thank you. That was just such a wonderful introduction and summary of my book, Jane, and it's a delight and honor to have you as my interlocutor. So the question, I think it's probably best to take the question quite literally, which is, what is a camera obscura? Since I think that it is a very technical object, and I'm not sure if a lot of people actually know how it works. I know going into this book, I didn't really know, but to me, it was really all over the place in the 18th century. And in terms of the conception of interiority, originally this book was going to be about interiority and interiors in 18th century England. And that seemed like a very, in a lot of ways, it was a lot more conventional project where I was looking at novels and representations of interiors and interiority in novels. But I'm not sure at what point that it turned, but I think it was from getting into a fight with someone who read my book and said that, so they noticed that there is this emphasis on the camera obscura, and that emphasis actually came from Locke's theory of the mind. And that's the extract or excerpt from Locke that is quoted and requoted all the time to explain Locke's empiricism, which is the mind is like the camera obscura. So that is just the most definitive model for what a mind, the empirical mind, is. And when he refers to the camera obscura, he says, think of the mind as being like a dark room that's wholly shut off except for one window or door in which the light comes through. And through that light, all the images of the outside world come inside. And he says, and there's something really elegiac about this. And this is what I really wanted to lean into, this aspect of Locke's description of the mind through the camera obscura, which is when he says, if the images that came in through that ray of light into the dark room would but stay there, it would be exactly like the mind of humans, meaning that those images that move through the mind, that come through the light, the ray of light, are work like our thoughts that don't stay in memory. Like, so he's talking about, well, humans have the faculty of memory, which allows those images to stay there. So I think that's because that played such a central role in my definition, the working definition of interiority in the 18th century. Someone who read the manuscript said, your book is about theories of mind. It's not really about the camera obscura. And I actually got really pissed off about that. And as someone who's a material culture scholar, and someone who is really invested in the materiality of subjectivity, the material history of subjectivity, I realized that I had to stop leaning on this sort of vague idea of what a camera obscura was and work with camera obscuras to actually give it the leading role that it needed to sort of fight for. Because I did have to. I realized I was at this point in terms of being in dialogue with another scholar that in order for the camera obscura to stop being merely a metaphor, I had to work firsthand with camera obscuras and figure out how they worked, and experience them. And what's so fascinating about the camera obscura is that it does, I mean, as you said, you're not quite sure what it is, but because it had so many different guises. I mean, it has these, it shifts into these different shapes throughout time. And the point that I was interested in reclaiming for the camera obscura, especially for this book that was on spaces of interiority, was to highlight the fact that it was originally a room, is foremost a room, like quite literally the Latin, a dark room, camera obscura, and before it became a device. And I think that is how a lot of scholars have tended to trivialize the camera obscura as a device or a tool, but not so much a space. And it was actually during the Renaissance and the early modern period that the camera obscura was used as a room. So it's basically a room to that you shut you create a camera obscura just by closing the shutters in your room. And so you turn the space into a dark space so that you can allow one ray of light, so that you can create the conditions by which light will come through one very local space. And that's how the images, that's how it becomes a machine for images to come through. And I think that the very first citation of the camera obscura that I came across, just to give you a sense of the scope of its history and its mutability as a device. And I think that also gets at the sort of the concept, it's the conceptual aspects of the camera obscura. But Aristotle refers to, in the 4th century BC, refers to the camera obscura when he says that he noticed when, I think it was during an eclipse, that he was standing outside and he saw the ground, on the ground next to a tree, images of the sun passing on the ground. And the way that happened was through the spaces between the leaves. So I just think that that's really incredible, that you don't even need a room or a box or an actual enclosure, but that would just be the most efficient way in which you could create the camera obscura effect. So I think that, I think that it's that's the best definition for it, is that it's a medium, and it's a medium that works through creating a space, whether it's a space of a room, the space of a box, any sort of effective enclosure. In the instance of the Aristotle example, it's the space created between leaves. And Aaron Hill, this figure in the 18th century, in 1767, had pointed out that camera obscuras are everywhere in nature. He talks about how in a hedge, like in an opening in a hedge, the images come through it, and you see projections of the world on the ground. So it's basically a device that creates the conditions in which light can travel through a hole into a dark space, so that images of the world can be projected. And I think that it's really it really does work as a medium. So I love that quotation when you refer to the Siskin and Warner rendition of the Enlightenment as an event in the history of mediation. And in so many ways, this book, My Dark Room, is a moment in that history of mediation. And to get back to what I was trying to do with this particular history of mediation, is to look at the medium as an environment, as a space. And indeed, that is one of the definitions of medium.
Yeah, that is so fascinating and so elucidating, needless to say. Yeah, I was so interested in the shift in what you just said from talking about light coming in through spaces, right? And then at the very last minute, you used the word that I would have used, which is it's coming in through a hole, right? And that
As opposed to an aperture, is that what
yeah,
you're saying?
but no, I
Yeah.
feel like the whole is like space is so creative and positive as a term. It's like they have these openings and possibility, and a whole that's the image that starts to evoke this sense of, the elegiac, right? And this sort of transient and this what isn't there, and what won't be there forever. And I feel that in your book too. I mean, I feel as if there is a really profound so much of your book is about the play of the imagination in that space, right? It's really so much about the pleasures of interiority and discovering all these possibilities and possibilities for self-knowledge, enacted through writing as well, that emerge from this. But I did also feel, you have the chapter on Cavendish and her closet, and it ends with her tomb, and your book is dedicated to your father's memory, right? And there is always this sense of transience. I was thinking about melancholia so often, in this book and the ways in which it's offering, in some ways a counter history of melancholy. We always start with Dürer and that wood block, right? And the idea that melancholy arises from just this space that's so flooded with light, and it creates all this kind of anxiety within that. And, you have a very different thing kind of happening here. I think ultimately indeed around transience. I felt that in the research process, because so much of your images so the photographs in this book are really interesting. And in some ways they speak to the triumph of the photographic medium over the camera obscura, right? Because everything we're seeing is a photograph that's interacting in really dynamic, interesting ways. And there's so many different kinds of photographs, and some of them are taken by you, and some of them are you, right? But and some of them are of rooms, in Cavendish's house in particular. And those are so haunting to me, right? And I had the sense that when you were involved in the research for this book, which took you all over the world, right? But I think really began here in California. We start in Santa Monica, and we start with you holding physically a camera lucid, and we come back to that at the end, camera obscura. We come back to that at the end. But I just did have the sense also of, a scholar sort of moving through these spaces that are at some extent really vacant now, right? Like the bodies that were in them are gone. And that even applies to so much of this is about the experience of the book and the page, right? That's one of the most important analogies to the camera obscura, is how the page is working, right? But just the sense that these are potentially evacuated spaces, right? That you're kind of moving in almost a kind of ghostly way, that they're not here anymore, and this turns to, I think, maybe a really obvious thing to ask you about, but partly just the experience of doing research in that way, if that's part of what it was, but also the book itself, right? And its disappearance. I really just derived so much pleasure from physically holding this book, right? And I felt so many things happen to me as a reader of your book that could only happen when I was handling the page. It's very much what you were just talking about. Most people are probably going to read this as an ebook, right? And it would be unreadable. Nobody could get it with a Kindle. Or with an audiobook, right? So there is another kind of death behind this, I think, in some ways. And I wonder if you've thought about that and the extent to which what you've written is an elegy for an object. You talk about the camera obscura being used by contemporary artists at the end, so it's still out there, but it's kind of a novelty. The lab in Santa Monica, where you start off, has closed. It has one of those permanently closed, dreaded post-pandemic tags on its website.
Oh, it's closed?
Yes, and
It's closed forever?
Yes, and
I didn't. Oh, that's what you were referring to. I had no idea.
Yeah. So I'm just. I just wonder if we could talk a little bit, or I could just ask you to talk more about disappearance, right? And because we kind of feel like the camera obscura was always there, and then at some level it kind of always will be there because it's such a powerful metaphor for the way we experience space, just exactly as you laid out. But there's also this other thing. So I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that kind of undertow, and if that also drove you. I'd also love to hear you say even more about the research process for this, because I think it was really a fascinating sort of itinerary that you were on over many years through many different communities. Yeah. So anyway.
Yeah, that's also poignant, Jane, like all the little points that you picked up. And I think that, I don't want to go all over the place. There's so many different areas. I didn't really finish answering the question about how I went about reckoning with the camera obscura as an actual thing, as something that you experience in an embodied fashion. And so that picks up on what you just talked about. You just referred to the Santa Monica camera obscura. In so many ways, this is such a California book. It's such a Los Angeles book. I could not have written this anywhere else. And so I was just quite fortuitous to be in Los Angeles at a very formative stage of writing this book. And indeed, the people that I met in Los Angeles and the conversations I got to have with many different important people in my life, they became important. So I think that it all comes together in what you're referring to. I mean, including you, Jane. This is where we really got to develop our friendship. But it does sort of point to the way that it all resolved itself in a book. And so the book itself becomes some sort of repository for life, a scholar's life. And I think that's what I was trying to get at with the camera obscura. It's this fascinating dynamic that I'm not sure that anyone has really sort of explored. There's a way in which one fixates on the idea of dark spaces as unhappy spaces or isolated spaces or spaces of exile. But I feel that the work on this book, this is a time of transience in my life, a time of transience that I did not know would end at some point, and I would end up somewhere else besides Los Angeles. But I think that I was also semi-aware of the fact that this is a moment in time that was passing. And that is what was, what's at play with the camera obscura, is that it allows the images of reality to be projected back to you as if it were a product of the imagination. And as Locke points out, those images don't stay there. They vanish. It's like a document. It's a documentary device. It gives you information about external reality that's impermanent. So in this really interesting way, this book was biographical in that it received the impressions or projections of everything that I encountered during this period of time, including my visit to the Santa Monica camera obscura, which completely exploded my sense of what a camera obscura was and does, and gave me that entry to an understanding of it as a device and space for the imagination, and not what has been its predominant image to scholars, which is that it's a device for science, for scientific precision. It's a device for capturing realism. I mean, it allows artists to produce images of landscapes, rooms, with perspectival realism, and also that it was actually used as a tool of science in the observation of eclipses. And I think that's how certain scholars have rendered the camera obscura. And also it's sort of gotten reduced to being a piece of technology that served as a precursor to the more advanced technology for image creation, the photographic camera. So being in the Santa Monica Camera Obscura, which was that room at the top of the recreation center of the Santa Monica beach, it was like a moment of illusion, and just being amazed by how different reality was through the image creation of the camera obscura and through being inside that dark room. And I also experienced, and I have to say, this book is also very indebted to meeting Erkki Huhtamo. He's a media archaeologist who is a professor at UCLA, and he collects optical devices, very old optical devices, including camera obscuras and zogroscopes, and what else? The magic lantern. So he has all of that in his condominium in Culver City, and I met him at a party. I mean, so it's just amazing how this, like, as I said, I had to be in Los Angeles for this book to come into being. So I had this really priceless opportunity to go to this man's home and use a camera obscura, not just once, but twice, because then we used the camera obscura on the campus of UCLA, and I got to see it, the way it functions in different environmental conditions. And so it just gave me all these sorts of information about the way that it functions when you hold it in your hand as a box versus the sort of camera obscura that you stand inside of, like the Santa Monica camera obscura. But what's so fascinating about the box camera obscura, that it brings reality back to you in a different space from what you expect. So just from the way that it the image is reproduced inside the device. So I just remember standing inside of his kitchen, and he had this big paper globe for his lampshade, this hanging lampshade that he had in his kitchen. And I was holding the camera obscura. I was really shocked that that lampshade was in my hands.
I think you even write about that moment. Yeah.
Yeah, no, so
Yeah.
you read my book. So yes, I try to capture that, because there is something, you know, as you've written about the Gothic and the uncanny, but
Yeah.
so yeah.
I mean, I have like 5 different ways I want to go on the basis of what you just said. And Meredith needs to sort of keep me to time too, keep us to time. So I'm aware of that fleeting time. So I think that I know in your book, there's a photograph that he took of you on the roof of the Broad at UCLA. Is that right? And you're holding the camera obscura. And that just speaks to the incredible kind of variety, you know, the photographs themselves that are in this book, right? Some of them taken, you know, some of them of you, some of them taken by you, you know, some of them by archival photographers, you know. So that aspect is really interesting. But in terms of what you just said, I have a couple of sort of go either way. But one thing that just occurred to me is that pressing on the other side of these rooms is the natural environment, right? You know, and that there's a space outside the space that rooms are in, you know, that's being brought in. And you know, I'm not sure, you know, what actually happens in that dynamic and how it relates to what happens between the room and the person in the room and what's being seen in the object. But the other thing that I was thinking about, you were describing his kitchen and all these, or his house and his sort of collection of various seeing instruments, right? And when we think of the 18th century, this is what we always think of, right? We think of the microscope, we think of, you know, the perspective glass, we think of, you know, eyeglasses, we think of all these different devices, right? The sort of jumble of devices, of which the camera obscura is one. It is also, I love the fact that you're not going to think about it as a precursor to the camera lucida, which a lot of scholars like Jeffrey Batchen are rethinking anyway in terms of what came before it. I mean, a lot of people actually are thinking of it as having come out of writing, you know. But the camera obscura is kind of one of those things, but it's also really different. I kept thinking of Gulliver's Travels, and you don't talk about that. You're much more interested in sort of narrative fiction, right? Even when you're talking about poems. But you know, I was thinking, what if Gulliver had, which and that satire works so similarly in some ways to what you're describing, right? I mean, he's asleep all the time, right?
Yeah.
Everything is, but it's motivated, right? And swift, and there's also the element of irony, which you're not working with in quite, or satire, which you're obviously not working with in the same way. But I was just thinking, you know, what if, like, you know, one of the things that was emptied out of one of his pockets, and you have the fabulous chapter on Pamela's pockets, you know, was actually not just the glasses and the perspective glass, but was also a camera obscura, right? You know, like one of the portable ones. Like, what difference would that make? And I feel like this is what you're giving us in terms of, you know, we're in like profoundly visual culture, right, in the 18th century, and even though you talk about some of the other senses that are kind of available peripherally, at least, with it's really, your book too is very much about what we see, right? So it shares that disposition with you know, other scholars who worked on these tools, seeing them very much as, you know, you know, I'm thinking of Tito Chico's work in particular in the microscope, right? But seeing it as, you know, those objects as the sort of basis of what we call formal realism. And the camera obscura is kind of one of them, but it wouldn't be in Gulliver. I mean, there would be a completely different book if the camera obscura had been one of his objects, right? And I think it just changes so much to include it among all of these technologies of seeing and that are available to us in the period, and they're in the literature, and they're in the criticism on the literature. So what do you see the camera obscura as maybe changing in terms of, you know, what we're saying about the literature in particular? We've talked more about the, you know, the object and the books, right? But still, I would just be interested in what difference it makes, you know, in some of our basic categories of understanding. And I know you talk about setting in the book. Realism is an important term, you know. So anyway, that's my question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're asking a question: what difference does this understanding of the camera obscura make on the history of 18th century English literature, right? Yeah. I think that it's very much related to what you were doing in Ayer's appearance, and this idea of atmosphere, that there is something, I mean, this is just a mental tendency that I have, but really trying to see see concrete things in an imaginative way. And I think that is, to me, the crux of what's so novel about 18th century literature is this sudden delight in rendering reality.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
You know, like all the concrete dimensions of reality appearing on the page. And it was through my tactile spatial experiences with the camera obscura that I could see that that's exactly what the camera obscura is doing. You know, which is to bring representations of reality back to you, so that you see that this is reality, but there is this fictive aspect to it. It doesn't, you know, there's something ineffable. It's not concrete. I mean, it goes back to the understanding of atmosphere that you develop. It's something both concrete and immaterial, and the camera obscura is a device that that allows that impression of reality to be felt on a physical level. And I think that it's useful. You call the work that I do with a camera obscura as a heuristic. Um, and I think that that is a useful term, because conceptually a heuristic is a device for understanding ideas or understanding how to approach information in the world. But the camera obscura is literally a device too. And I see that it becomes this device for aesthetic representation, literary representation. And just to pick up on what you mentioned earlier about my interest in narrative fiction, more even when I'm talking about poetry, I think that that's right. I mean, that's exactly the sort of picture of the world that the camera obscura allows, which is a moving picture of the world. It's the world in motion. That's why it's very different from the photographic camera. Isn't that right, Alan? My editor happens to be a really accomplished photographer. So I feel like he has a lot to say in this conversation. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this at some point. But yes, I mean, do you want to say something, Alan?
No, I'm enjoying hearing you talk about the camera obscura.
Okay.
Unfortunately,
Right.
yeah. Please go on.
Okay. Right, yeah, because there is something very elegiac about the photographic camera too, and what it's like to engage with it as a documentary device for lived reality, lived experiences. But what's different or special about the camera obscura is that its images are streaming as the events are taking place it's a live stream of the world. And that must have been one of the reasons why I felt determined to put so much emphasis on this device, because it does resonate with our own culture. It's a hyper mediated culture, the way that we live now. And what the camera obscura does is allow you to mediate your experiences quite readily. And what is narrative but something that moves and changes? You cannot have a story if there's no change. You have to have some sort of transformation take place. You have to have something different happen from what something or someone was at the beginning of at the beginning. And so I think that that's another reason why I feel the camera obscura is a really important artifact and experience to recover as a way to understand the development of 18th century literature better.
I think it also, back to sort of tactility, which is related to mobility, right? I mean, that's the dimension of tactility is its temporality and that sense of movement that this is what because it is the thing that immediately comes to mind as we're all in our little rooms on this screen. And, at some level I was kind of thinking, it's like someday there will only be the camera obscura. There won't be a person in there, right? It will just be, AI is sort of like projecting its hallucinations on its own wall. Like there's this sort of really difficult place that this takes us. And but that comes back to just what you've emphasized again and again. And it's something I can't do, and that I really so admire about your work is exactly that sense of tactility and what it means to touch something. And you really do restore, and partly because of the way you read, right? Like I really feel like you're sort of touching the text that you're working with, right? That there is a touch dimension here. I mean, obviously we're at some level of abstraction, right? But that is a crucial component of the camera obscura. I mean, as you know, like my work is on Helen Keller right now, right? Who of course is in the dark room, and Diana Fuss has written about this in the sense of an interior, in a really powerful way as well. But the idea of, that you can actually be in the camera obscura without being sighted, and the ways that it actually does ultimately kind of potentially take us out of a relentlessly visual culture, and also bring back into that something of, just human, the human body, right? you know, it's really interesting. You have Pope in the grotto, and you don't actually talk about Pope's body in the sort of center of the grotto, although that's an important sort of dimension of it. But to me, that's just one of the amazing things that you've brought to this, and it turns back on, you know, just again that, you know, I'm looking at your just the very first page. This is My Dark Room. We don't even have the subtitle right on the very first page of your book, right? It's just those 3 words, and you know, and that it starts with you writing as you, right? You start in the second person there, you know, but just that this is about a person moving in these, you know, literary and physical spaces is such an incredible part of this book, and the sense of inevitability about it, right? You know, it's kind of like, you know, it's not, I mean, I love that it's not a precursor, it is still with us, and we can restore some of this to it, I use it to restore some things to what we have left, I think is really amazing. I wanted to, how do you move on from this, right? So how do you, because you know, I also want to talk to you about the cover of the book, but I'm positive, I'm not looking at my clock, but I'm sure we're out of time here. But just you are such an active scholar, right? And I mean, there's just, you know, the sense of quest, right? And just, you know, through various, as I say, sort of spaces and communities is, you know, you're not going to be giving that up. But I kind of feel like, what do you do after this, right? Like, how do you, just as a critic, like where do you go next? And I guess the related question, since you start with the second person in your book, there's always a you here, right? Like, where would you expect or hope your readers would take your book next, and the insights that you've offered, right? Because I think this is just a kind of argument that both as a methodological model and in terms of what you say is something that people will be using, right, in the future. Will you be using this? What's next for you? What's next for us if we're working with this book? And that's, I think it's probably an appropriate last question to ask.
Well, I wish I had time to answer everything. I well, I mentioned this in my acknowledgments, but it was really this more of an understanding that you could create your own dark rooms and the spaces that you inhabit. And what I loved about working on this book was that it just made me so much more sensitive to space and, you know, architectural personalities of spaces, and the way that it could really get you more situated in your mind and become friends with the thoughts that pass through your mind. And you know, these spaces give you access to what's going on the interior level, and I think that's something that I would love for people to take away from this book. As you know, I had a creative fiction writer write a review of this book for recently, and I think it was really interesting that she stopped talking about my book, but started talking about her own spaces of writing, her own so-called writing closets. And so that's another thing that I love that the fact that she really picked up on something, even though she wasn't a literary historian, but that she picked up on that on a very internal level, that this book really makes you more in touch with your own spaces of creativity. So that's something that I'd like for people to take away from this, is use the spaces around you to make you better friends with the space of your own mind. And I didn't get this book out in time for the height of the pandemic, but I think that would have been a nice time for it, because that was a condition that forced a lot of people to, you know, to face that possibility.
Yeah. What about for you?
Well, the thing, I do want to go back to the book thing, because you see, you're quite, it's as if you apprehend exactly what I'm moving on to next, which is to look at, I mean, my first book was on objects and inanimate objects made to look human. And this book is on spaces and interior spaces and who you are on the inside through what surrounds you. But the next book is on the page, the space of the page, as you know, the space where you can see who you are, and looking at that space as a very dynamic and multimedia space. So you know, a space of life writing, and looking at life writing as something that comes about through the material means by which you write things down. So it gets to your, your fascination with the book.
That makes perfect sense. And I just looked at the time. So Meredith, I think it's time for you to field I know we're getting
You are
questions.
exactly right. We have 2
Mhm.
questions so far in the chat. And anyone else who wants to ask anything, feel free to put your question in the chat or raise your hand. So Diane Perkis writes, wondering as I listened to Julia about the relationship between the camera obscura and various other visual devices like the phantasmagoria, which have more overtly fantastical elements. Thinking also of Terry Castle's work on the politics of that during the French Revolution made me want to ask whether the camera obscura has a political valency.
It definitely does, and a lot of people have worked on that valency, such as Marx. I think that's one of the I guess the key sites of the camera obscura as well. He uses it as a figure for the work of ideology, the way that the reality can be represented, or things that are basically fictive are represented back to you as reality. And you're right, the main difference between the camera obscura and the magic lantern or phantasmagoria is that the images that come through those sorts of devices that Terry Castle is working with, magic lanterns, is that those images are created beforehand. Someone sits down and creates these pictures of different scary things like the devil, Satan, Lucifer, images of Lucifer on painted glass that are projected onto the wall, and really aren't that scary. But yeah, so it's a story that someone else writes for you. I think that's the main difference, and that's what's so wonderful, I feel, about the camera obscura, is that it's the story of reality as you're living it.
Right, we also have a question from George Belugos, and I apologize if I'm saying anyone's last name incorrectly. Can you comment on how your attention to space and spaces via the camera obscura might impact the ways we conceive of form or formalism in the novel?
Thanks for that question, George. That kind of tough question. I think you probably know how I should answer this. But form and formalism in the novel. Well, one of the critical insights that I came up with when I was writing this book was that the work of Gothic fiction should be in histories of the British novel, because the Gothic novel is also very attentive to space and the psychological experiences and transformations that take place in specific settings, like a Gothic castle. And there's actually a certain amount of agency in architectural spaces in the Gothic novel and landscape spaces. So I think that that's one thing that's different. And Jane, you, in fact, that's one of the points that you make in Heir's appearance, is the way that the Enlightenment, the narrative of the Enlightenment, has somehow exiled, created the conditions of exile for something like the Gothic, because it's it takes up the supernatural, the irrational. So that's just one little foray into answering that question. If you have any thoughts on that, please feel free to speak up. I don't know if we have time for that sort of back and forth.
Yeah, we have a few more minutes, so if anyone wanted
Okay.
to jump in, that's wonderful.
I think you make that distinction between spatial formalism and formal realism in your book.
Mhm.
I think that also really would really speak to the question.
That is one of the things that I was trying to undo was excuse me? Did someone say something? Okay, I thought I heard a voice. Sort of a gothic moment. But the argument that Ian Watt makes in The Rise of the Novel, which is that one of the hallmarks of the novel is the fact that physical settings are, for the first time, represented in realistic detail in 18th century fiction. And the point that I make is that that sort of engagement with space, of seeing space as being an important condition of human experience and of something that has an impact on human psychology, is taking place within 18th century culture itself. And I wanted to show that there's some sort of that fiction, seeing fiction in lived spaces, was something that was going on in 18th century culture and not just in the novel. Because what I mean, to whom I'm very much indebted, has a way of looking at what is being represented as being sort of he just sort of takes those things for granted. Or I wanted to look at the material underpinnings of what was being represented in order to allow literature to be a more dynamic space as a tool for representation.
Great. We also have a question from Blaze Carter, who is a first-year Master of Library and Information Science student, who'd like to know more about your time in the MLIS program at UCLA and how it influenced your book.
That's such an interesting question. I think that was just a really great time, because it got me into contact with people who are very much interested in the camera obscura, such as Jonathan Ferner. He was one of the thesis advisors for the thesis I wrote for my MLIS degree. I had wonderful conversations with him about the camera obscura. He's actually a camera obscura enthusiast. So that was wonderful. I mean, this book was very much a product of having wonderful conversations with people. But also it was good to be at the same institution as Erkki Huhtamo. And I originally got to LA through a fellowship that I was awarded at the Huntington, a program called the Materialities, I think, John, you're here, Materialities, Texts and Images program, the MTI program that John Brewer headed with Steve Hindle. And that was really, I think, an important precursor for me to, for my orientation as a scholar, to really allow materiality and visuality be integral to the study of texts. Yes, I hope that answers your question. I think that if you're interested in going to UCLA, I hope you can tell from my work that it is sort of a living environment for you to pursue intellectual projects like this, as well as get your training in library studies.
All right, and we'll wrap things up with a last question from Louisa Kale. I was struck by a quotation that describes the mechanism of the camera obscura as throwing the image onto the requisite white space. Can you say more about that?
Yes, Louisa, I hope that, I mean, you could unmute yourself and so you can answer my question. But what is it about the what about this quotation struck you? Throwing the image onto the requisite white space. Okay, well, I don't want to put you on the spot, so I'll keep talking because well, what did you want to say? I think you have something interesting to say, as you always do.
No, I'm really fascinated because I have thought about the camera obscura quite a lot, and I have encountered quite a lot of accounts of it. But this idea of throwing the image is just amazing. I mean, I love the way you tease out the movement of the camera obscura image production, but the idea that there's an action of throwing that produces those effects, it's extraordinary. I mean, I kept thinking of the discobolus, these images, very concrete and embodied images of the act of throwing. It's an absolutely extraordinary verb to use. So
yes, well, I mean, it's just so, I mean, that's what I love about 18th century language, is that it's so physical and so it's of life. And I just saw that as a literal translation of the word project. And so that's just another way that the 18th century idiom really turns these words that we take for granted into a physical action. But it's very dynamic. It's not just taking a picture. It's the picture is thrown onto the requisite white space, which I love too, that the need of white space to be there in order for the camera obscura to complete its function. And the white space can be anything. It's so metaphorical, isn't it? I mean, it's screen, it's the wall in a room, it's the page in a book. But it's basically a space that allows this image to come into being. And I think that that's another way of answering one of your questions, Jane, which is that I want this book to show people or readers that you can create spaces. You can create the space of your imagination through these requisite actions and settings. This moment where as you tease out these moments in your experience and see them with greater poignancy and saturation of color.
All right, we'll go ahead and end things there. Julie, Jane, thank you so much for a fantastic conversation. And congratulations to Julie on the publication of a fantastic new book. Thanks as well to the Seminary Co-op for their support of this event. And thank you to everyone who attended today.
Thank you.
Thank you.